sex isn't special. That's the claim, and it immediately clashes with everything people have been taught to believe. Most people instinctively resist it. They want sex to mean something deeper, something emotional, something sacred. But when you step back and look at it through a colder, more analytical lens, that assumption begins to fall apart. Because what people call special is often not in the act itself, but in how they feel about it. And that distinction matters more than most realize. There are still many who try to defend the sanctity of sex, to elevate it above other human experiences. They treat it as something rare, something that must be protected, something that carries inherent value. But that value isn't universal, it's subjective. It exists in the individual, not in the act. And this mismatch in perception creates real consequences, especially in the dynamics between men and women. When one person believes something is inherently precious, they begin to demand compensation for it, material, emotional, even spiritual. But the real question is simple. Where does that value actually come from? Because if you strip away the feelings, what's left might not be nearly as special as people think. When someone believes their sexual access is highly valuable, their behavior begins to reflect that belief. They don't give it away freely. That would feel irrational. Instead, they require something in return, some form of compensation that justifies what they perceive as a significant offering. This compensation can take many forms. It might be material, money, gifts, dinners, experiences. It might be emotional, attention, validation, excitement, reassurance. It might even be framed in spiritual or relational terms: love, commitment, exclusivity, devotion. And the more valuable someone believes their sexual access to be, the more they expect in exchange. The price rises in direct proportion to the perceived rarity and importance of the thing being offered. But this raises a critical question. What is actually being exchanged? If we examine the act itself, it's not particularly long-lasting. In most cases, it's over relatively quickly. It's not enduring in its effects either. Whatever satisfaction it provides tends to fade, sometimes quickly. Yes, it is pleasurable. That's undeniable. But pleasure alone doesn't make something uniquely valuable. There are many sources of pleasure in life that are easier to access, less complicated, and far less costly. And importantly, for most people, this is not a one-time, non-renewable resource. Outside of very specific circumstances, it's something that can be offered again and again. There is no inherent depletion in the act itself. In fact, over time, some individuals may even improve their ability to extract value from it, becoming more strategic, more selective, or more effective in negotiating what they receive in return. This begins to resemble something less like a sacred exchange and more like a marketplace dynamic. In any marketplace, price is not determined solely by personal belief. It's determined by comparables, by what similar goods or services are being exchanged for elsewhere. If something is widely available at a low cost, it becomes extremely difficult to justify a significantly higher price, regardless of how valuable it feels to the seller. Imagine trying to sell a cup of coffee for $100 when similar coffee is available everywhere for a few dollars. You might insist that your coffee is special. You might believe it wholeheartedly. But unless there is something objectively different, something that justifies the price, most people will simply walk away. The market won't support it. And this is where friction begins to emerge. Because while some individuals see their offering as rare and precious, the broader environment may not reflect that valuation. In a deregulated sexual marketplace, access can often be obtained with relatively low investment. This lowers the perceived baseline value across the board. Yet, despite this, many still hold firmly to the belief that their particular offering is different, that it should command more, that it deserves recognition, respect, and compensation at a higher level than what is commonly observed. From their perspective, this makes perfect sense. But from the perspective of others operating in the same environment, it can appear disconnected from reality. This disconnect is best understood through a simple analogy. Imagine owning an old object that has been passed down through generations. To you, it carries immense sentimental value. It represents history, identity, emotional connection. But to someone else, someone who has no relationship to that history, it is just an object. They evaluate it based on its material condition, its functionality, its comparables in the market. They might look at it and see where imperfections, limitations, and based on that, they assign it a modest price. Now you're faced with a dilemma. Do you accept that price, even though it feels far too low? Or do you walk away holding on to something that feels priceless to you, but is not recognized as such by others? The object hasn't changed, only the perception of its value differs. And this is the core issue. Much of what people consider special about sex is not embedded in the act itself, but in the emotional meaning attached to it. That meaning can be deeply personal, even profound, but it is not transferable by default. It is not automatically recognized or honored by others. When those personal valuations collide with external realities, tension is inevitable, because in the end, value in any exchange is only real if both parties agree on it. And when they don't, what you feel something is worth and what someone else is willing to give can be worlds apart. To understand why people insist that sex is special, you have to look beyond the act itself and examine what they're really trying to defend. Because when most people say sex is special, they're not making a descriptive claim about reality. They're making a normative claim about how things should be. They're arguing that sex deserves to be treated with care, restraint, and significance, that it shouldn't be casual, that it shouldn't be indiscriminate, that it should happen under the right conditions with the right person after the right level of investment. In other words, they are trying to impose a framework of meaning onto something that in its raw form doesn't inherently contain it. And when you follow that argument to its logical conclusion, it starts to resemble something very close to religion. Because what is being described is no longer just a physical act. It becomes symbolic, spiritual, a kind of union that transcends biology. Two people merging not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, even existentially. A bond that is said to leave a lasting imprint, something that cannot be undone. This is the highest form of the argument, the idea that sex is not just meaningful, but sacred. But once you step into that territory, a different set of comparisons becomes relevant. Because if sex is truly a spiritual act, then it must be evaluated alongside other spiritual practices. And when you do that, the logic begins to strain. Consider the idea of a deeply intimate spiritual experience, something like communion with the divine. In many traditions, this is presented as the ultimate form of union, a direct connection with something transcendent, something infinite, something far beyond human limitation. And yet, in many cases, access to that experience is not restricted by wealth, status, or elaborate negotiation. It is often freely available, repeatable, and open to anyone willing to participate. Now, contrast that with the way people attempt to structure access to sex under the It's Special framework. Suddenly, the requirements become far more stringent. There are expectations of investment, demonstrations of value, layers of qualification. It becomes selective, conditional, even transactional in its own way, despite being framed as something above transaction. And this creates a contradiction. If something is truly elevated, truly spiritual, then restricting access to it based on material or performative criteria starts to undermine the very claim being made. It doesn't elevate the act, it complicates it. At this point, it becomes useful to shift away from abstract ideals and look at a more grounded analogy. Imagine an ideal way of eating, not just consuming food to satisfy hunger, but doing it in a way that is deeply fulfilling on every level. You sit down with people you care about. The food is high quality, thoughtfully prepared. There is conversation, connection, a sense of presence. The experience nourishes not just the body, but the mind and the emotions. Most people would agree that this is an ideal, But now consider how often people actually eat this way. In reality, most meals are quick, convenient, sometimes rushed. People eat alone, on the go, in between obligations. The conditions are far from ideal. And yet, those meals still serve a purpose. They still provide energy. They still sustain life. The ideal exists, but it is not the standard. Now imagine if access to food were restricted only to those ideal conditions. If you could only eat when everything was perfectly aligned, time, people, environment, preparation, most people wouldn't meet those conditions regularly. The result would be obvious. People would go hungry. The same principle applies here. There may be an ideal context for sex, one that includes emotional connection, mutual respect, even commitment, but that doesn't mean that every instance must meet those criteria to be valid or meaningful in its own way. People engage in sex for many different reasons, under many different conditions. Some of those reasons may not be ideal, some may even be unhealthy, but not all non-ideal behavior is inherently wrong. The problem arises when the ideal is treated as the only acceptable form, because then it stops being an ideal and becomes a restriction. And when you impose that kind of restriction on something that is widely desired, widely available, and biologically driven, you create tension between what people believe should happen and what actually happens. This tension shows up in expectations, in frustration, in mismatched assumptions between individuals navigating the same space with completely different frameworks. One person might approach the situation with a sense of gravity, expecting significance, investment, meaning. Another might approach it pragmatically, seeing it as an experience, a moment, a source of pleasure without deeper implications. Neither perspective is inherently invalid, but they are not compatible without alignment. And that is where most of the confusion comes from, because people are not just negotiating the act, they are negotiating the meaning behind it. And when those meanings don't match, the outcome rarely feels fair to both sides. In the end, the idea that sex is special says more about human psychology than it does about the act itself. What people are really protecting is not sex, but the meaning they've attached to it, the emotions, the expectations, the identity wrapped around the experience. But meaning is not inherent, it's assigned. And once you recognize that, a different picture starts to emerge. Sex can be many things. It can be casual or deeply intimate. It can be strategic, emotional, impulsive, or deliberate. It can happen under ideal conditions or far from them. None of these automatically make it more or less special in any universal sense. They simply reflect different contexts and different intentions. The mistake is assuming that your personal valuation must be shared by others. Because when expectations are built on that assumption, disappointment becomes almost inevitable. A more grounded approach is to separate the act from the meaning, to understand that feelings may enhance an experience, but they do not define its objective value. And once that distinction is clear, interactions become easier to navigate. Not because sex becomes less important, but because you finally see it for what it is, rather than what you've been told it should be.